And the only thing I found really in that about 10 years of looking that was different in identical twins turned out to be the gut microbiome.
Mm.
And that was in about 2011. And that got me thinking, so wow, if that's the only thing that's different, that could explain, you know, why we see these big differences in disease. And if that's true, then clearly diet and lifestyle are going to be really important. And maybe that's the missing link in a way.
Dr. Spector is a professor of epidemiology at King's College London and scientific co-founder of Zoe, the science and nutrition company. He's the best-selling author of The Diet Myth, Spoon-Fed, and Food for Life, the original pioneer of microbiome research, and is among the top 100 most-cited scientists in the world.
We were floored by the conversation, and we don't usually say that, and we hope that you all will be too.
I think one of the most compelling things is actually at the end when we distill all of the inspiring talk down to 6 main points to take home. So stay tuned.
So without further ado, Dr. Tim Spector.
Looking at the body of work that you've done to date, it's an amazing journey, from Twins UK, possibly the richest clinical data set in the world, to now leading the largest nutritional research program in the world. It sounds like your lens through that work on human health and disease has pivoted from genes to gut, and specifically the microbiome. So maybe we can start by having you tell us a little bit about your origins in twin studies and some of the discoveries and realizations that you found that led to this pivot from genes to gut.
Yeah, so I switched from, well, I started the twin studies about 1992, 1993, really from more mainstream epidemiology. I'd done a little bit of my thesis was on hormones and arthritis, and I'd done a bit of epidemiology, did a master's in epidemiology, and I thought, what's a really good idea to do? And so I came up with this idea of doing a twin studies because no one was really doing them in the UK at the time, and it just seemed super cool. The idea of looking at twins and nature nurture. We didn't know a lot about the genetic basis of most diseases back then, and so a lot of it was new and exciting. Just to go through a whole range of common diseases and work out whether it was commoner in identical twins compared to non-identical twins. So it was, yeah, that was probably the best decision of my career, really, because it allowed me to use one single model and look at hundreds of diseases and traits and personalities and everything from, voting, how you were going to vote, to your sexuality, to whether you had back pain or breast cancer. And so it was a real treat for someone like me who was constantly interested in new areas and finding out new things that people hadn't thought about before. And so then after a few years, the genetic revolution kicked in and people started having really good ways of looking at the genes, and everyone predicted that genes would be the answer to everything. And I was definitely one of those people. And it certainly got me lots of grants and papers. So that was it certainly helped my career. And I believed in pretty much genetic determinism. But then it became obvious that we were finding more, it wasn't just one gene for every disease. They were like, hang on a minute, we've got 1,000 for this disease. What's going on? They can't all be that important. The knockout gene that, we could cure with a magic bullet. So as it got more complex, I started to have a bit of doubts about that. And then I started looking at identical twins, why they were different. And, why one would get a certain disease, why one would get multiple sclerosis, the other one wouldn't. Why one would get depressed, the other one wouldn't, one would get overweight, etc. And why their personalities would often be different. And so I went through a lot of exploratory little pilots looking at things like blood markers and other tests, scans and things that might show differences between these, what we call discordant twins, who are genetic clones and lived together for 18 years, etc., etc. And the only thing I found really in that about 10 years of looking that was different in identical twins turned out to be the gut microbiome. And that was in about 2011. And that got me thinking, so wow, if that's the only thing that's different, that could explain why we see these big differences in disease. And if that's true, then clearly diet and lifestyle are going to be really important. And maybe that's the missing link in a way of how we've sort of up to that point dismissed nutrition and diet as being really important, because we got diverted by the cool tech of genetics, and forgot some of the basics because we couldn't explain why people were different, because a lot of diets are quite similar, and yet people were obviously responding differently to them in ways we hadn't thought. So that was that aha moment for me back in about 2011, 2012. And that was about the same time as I also had a mini stroke. I call it mini stroke, just it's not a medical term, as you know, for a vascular occlusion in the fourth cranial nerve.
So can we circle back to the idea that the microbiome is the only difference between identical twins? When I think of identical twins, I'm thinking of two genetically similar or identical individuals, but those individuals throughout their life, they can certainly be exposed to different unique environmental factors that might be protective or might predispose them to certain diseases. Can you tell me more about how the microbiome plays in as this sort of central idea or issue that is the only difference between those two individuals?
Yeah, obviously I may exaggerate and say it's the only difference, but you think of identical twins, they're born at the same time or within a few minutes of each other. They've got the same mother, the same parents. They generally go to the same school. They eat the same food. The DNA in all their cells is identical. And when you look at blood tests, they're highly correlated and they look the same. And, their fingerprints are slightly different, but, apart from that, they're spookily similar compared to, say, you and your siblings, or you two guys, you think about the way you are brought up. So it's relative to other people, they're much more similar. And that's the key object here. So that when you see, trying to explain why one twin would get cancer at the age of 25, get breast cancer or something, or another one would get an autoimmune disease, it's kind of hard to explain when generally they've lived together during most of their life, and their DNA and the proteins they're producing are pretty much similar. Now, I did look at epigenetics, which is the way genes are switched on and off, for about 10 years, thinking that might be the solution. And it does play a part, but I think it's quite a minor role. You can tweak the genes a little bit, but it's not a big deal. So the fact that these microbes were so different in these identical twins, and the genetic impact, there is some genetics on which microbes live in your gut, but it's like explains less than 10%, I'd say, of the differences between people, which is, compared to any other condition, trait, or test that I've looked at, is tiny. So you've got this other factor, and so it starts to make sense when you think about microbes as chemical factories. So they are converting the food that they're eating or grabbing from our mucus layer of our intestines and converting that into chemicals, which they pump out, and they're picked up as signals by our immune system, by our nervous system in the gut, and transmitted around the body. So if you think of it that way, you've got a completely different set of microbes to your brother or your sister, and you give them the same food, you're going to produce different chemical metabolites which will affect your body differently. So it's like, you've got a completely different pharmacy to your co-twin, even when given the same food. And so that's why this affects your blood so much, why you get different neurochemicals in your brain, because some of this pharmacy are chemicals like serotonin and GABA, other ones that you get with Valium type drugs, etc. So that's really what I was thinking when I first found this out, although I didn't know as much about the microbiome. We didn't know much in 10 years ago, anything like what we do now. But it was this chemical realization that it all comes down to chemistry, and food is basically chemistry. The food we eat is 70,000 different chemicals, and our body's full of chemicals and enzymes, and it turns out the microbes are basically chemical factories. So once you start thinking like that, it starts to make sense in a way that wasn't at all clear when I first got into this, because people thought microbes did something, each of them did something really weird, and they just produced antibiotics, and that was about it.
Yeah, you have such a unique perspective on this, given your prior work alongside your current work. So, would you be able to give some sort of percentage or frame of reference for the percent that you could attribute disease to genetics?
Yeah, I mean, I've published hundreds of papers on using twins to work out what diseases are heritable or not. Heritable is, what proportion of the differences between people can be attributed to their genetics. And, it's around 50% for most common diseases. And so there's clearly a genetic component that's there, but that is obviously influenced still by the environment. Doesn't mean the environment doesn't play a role. It just means you have a susceptibility. So we know that autoimmune disease, for example, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis, ulcerative colitis, celiac disease, MS, there'll be a genetic tendency to get that disease, but you need something else from the environment to trigger it. And we've been looking really for 100 years or so for that extra bit. What is that extra factor? And it turns out that most likely is it's your microbes and how they react to things like viruses or infections or diet or antibiotics or something in your early life that's triggered them to produce chemicals. They interact with your genes to then trigger the disease.
So have you been able to come up with a percentage that you would attribute to the microbiome itself versus genetics?
Not in a precise term, no.
Okay.
And I think it's going to vary much more with different diseases and at different ages. So it's probably stronger for things like food allergies.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, some of it is difficult because unlike genetics, which doesn't change, your microbiome's changing through life. And so some of your microbiome changes are actually caused by the disease itself, and others are a cause of the disease. So it can be both cause and consequence. So until we get some big long-term studies going over time, I don't think we'll be able to really answer this that proportion question.
Yeah.
Because we haven't really had the tools to do that until the last couple of years, really, with using genetic sequencing of the microbes.
Interesting. It's a fascinating analogy to think about the gut microbiome as a pharmacy, if you will. Can you just kind of put this organ system into perspective for us? The size, the scale, its function you talked about a little bit, but just kind of orient us to it a little bit more, and then we'll go through a couple more aspects of how it could play into disease.
Yeah, so if you put it all together, because most of the gut microbes are in your lower intestine, your colon, and we think there's probably over 100 trillion of these guys, about the same number of microbes as there are cells in your body.
Wow.
So we're at least half microbe, half human by that definition. And every time you go to the toilet, you become more human. I quite like that story. And we think that if you put them all together, so conceptually it is like a virtual organ, particularly if you start thinking of it in this chemical context, a bit like your liver. It weighs between 1.5 to 2 kilos, so 3 to 4 pounds, about the same as the brain. And that seems to, the sheer weight and amount of it should give it a critical importance. We can't live without it. Our brains don't develop normally without it. And we basically, all animals evolved to have a key microbiome inside us, producing many of these chemicals that our body couldn't produce itself. So, we have, maybe 20 gut hormones, and our microbes have thousands in order to break down the food. So rather than us wasting time producing them themselves, our gut microbes do it for us. They produce a lot of the B vitamins that we don't have to produce, et cetera, et cetera. So, and serotonin, the main driver, of the brain, is produced in our guts. So it's a sort of useful extra accessory that evolution's given us.
Yeah,
that helps us.
Yeah, can you circle back? That's an interesting point, that we can't live without our microbiome. I never really thought about that. I'd like to pull on that a little bit. Are you able to point to any studies or any even observations regarding, the lack of a microbiome being something that is fatal?
Well, we have to go to mouse models for that. Although Michael Jackson tried to do without them in his sterile bubble, most people have failed to get themselves totally clean. And so when you take sterile mice, their brains don't develop normally. They don't have normal responses of anxiety or fear, and they have to eat nearly twice as much food to stay alive, because they can't really break it down. And they are very susceptible to infections and have a very primitive immune system. So I don't think we would last very long, even if ethics committees did allow us to do that to babies, which they don't. So they really are crucial, and we're discovering more and more how crucial they are. And it's interesting, because just 20 years ago, everyone was trying to get rid of anything called a microbe. I was taught in medical school, you had to, just get rid of these guys, and there were these annoying things called commensals that used to always get in the way of any blood work you did. You were just told to, just ignore them. They're irritating. Yeah. And now, they're source of medical treatments and all kinds of breakthroughs. So it's changed massively in a short time.
That's a good transition to understanding the link between a microbiome imbalance or dysbiosis and disease. What is the mechanism there? Is it inflammation? Is it metabolic? Be interested to learn more there.
Well, we don't really know for sure yet. exactly what uh, is going on. And as I said, there's this problem in that in humans we can't really do causal work. You can't give people disease microbes and then see if they develop the disease.
Mm-hmm.
But you can do that in rodents and mice. So when you take disease microbes from humans, say with a particular condition, whether it's, I don't know, in your field, things like Parkinson's,
Mm-hmm.
or anxiety and depression, and you put them into sterile mice, you can then induce those disease, the similar disease in those mice. So that's how we establish some sort of causality. But it's usually not clear what compounds those microbes are producing yet to do that. Inflammation seems to play a big role.
Mm-hmm.
So generally, in the vast majority of chronic disease conditions, you'll have extra microbes that are there that like inflammatory conditions and produce inflammatory subchemicals. So they're revving up the immune system, if you like. And generally, healthy microbes are producing substances and have generally microbes that are dampening down the immune system. And as you know, there's this huge thing in the brain and neurology now that inflammation seems to be generally key to most disease and conditions. And I think a lot of this is being driven by our microbes and the food that we feed them. So the rather vague term, the inflammatory diet we had about 10 years ago, is starting to work its way out, because in itself it's not inflammatory, but it might induce microbes that like those conditions and carry on stimulating the immune system, which causes all kinds of problems for the body long term, whether it's aging, dementia, autoimmune disease, failure to fight cancer, etc., etc. So that's our current view. Now, we don't know much about the chemicals these guys produce yet. We know a few of them, but there are so many, we just haven't unraveled them and worked out what the key players are. We know some of the good guys, things like short chain fatty acids, but we don't know really all about the bad ones.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even in neurodevelopmental disorders, there seems to be a possible association with a dysfunctional microbiome, like examples ADHD and autism. I'm wondering if you could provide some insight into that.
Yeah, well, again, one insight is if you think there's a common basis for many of these conditions, which is again inflammation, and that the brain is getting the wrong signals from the gut. So I think we've changed our view on the brain in recent years. Rather than it's just another organ in the body, and it isn't all knowing and all controlling, it gets things wrong. Mm-hmm. And we know there's this massive brain gut connection that is not just through the vagus nerve, but it's through chemicals, it's through the immune system. And the blood-brain barrier isn't really a barrier. It's a very soft, filter that we think some of these conditions are caused by an imbalance between the two, that the gut might be sending signals to the brain, which the brain sees as disease and sort of shuts down in some ways or goes into defense mechanisms and then ends up behaving badly. So increasingly, conditions we thought were due to overbearing parents or, psychological traits, Freudian type problems, turn out actually to be problems of modern civilization, perhaps our poor diet and lifestyle, and the gut is translating those signals into signals the brain is then misinterpreting. That's my very sort of basic overview of a lot of these problems, because there's no doubt that many of these problems have increased at the same rate as our diet has deteriorated.
It puts a
And
high premium.
ultra processed foods have come into
Yeah.
our diet since the 1970s.
It puts a high premium on what we feed our kids, not just whether we punish or reward them to get them to behave.
Well, exactly, yes, and I think we've all seen these changes in our lifetime, and if you think of the punishment we've been meting out to our microbes in the last 50 years through the food we're eating, it's pretty frightening, because if you compare our microbiome diversity to hunter-gatherers or people living in developed countries, we have less than half the species that we used to have.
Wow.
We're doing some lovely studies with now with Zoe, the science and nutrition company I founded. We've now got several 100,000 gut samples, and just comparing Americans with Brits, for example, we see a clear correlation between how much ultra processed foods are there and the quality of the gut microbes, and indicators of health like these old fashioned. There's a parasite in there called blastocystis. Do you guys heard of that?
No.
Anyway. Generally, you'd been told to get rid of it. If you went to your family doctor and said, "I've got blastocystis," they will get rid of it. Take some strong medicine and get rid of it, like deworming a dog. It turns out that's a really healthy microbe that only healthy populations have, and only 5% of Americans have it.
Wow.
20% of Brits, and 100% of Africans and Asians, and we know it's associated with low fat levels and low cholesterol and low visceral fat. So it's many examples like this of how our healthy guts have shifted dramatically over the last few decades, and the US is leading the world on that, I'm afraid.
All right, so the podcast is brought to you by Contact Medical Services. This service puts you in touch with a verified concussion physician specialist within 24 hours of you having your injury. This is virtually unheard of anywhere in the country, and there's good reason for it. It's because our current healthcare system doesn't allow us to get to the specialists we need to get to in a timely manner. And when you're talking about brain injury, that's particularly important. A service like this could prevent the consequences of having a concussion, such as persistent cognitive and memory issues, headaches, psychological issues. So we're proud that they're sponsoring the podcast. We'll put their website at the bottom in the YouTube description. Please check them out. And let's keep going with the episode. Can we circle back? You mentioned the association of a dysfunctional microbiome with mental illness, right? I believe anxiety,
nearly all of them.
Anxiety, depression. Just a very very quick search on PubMed demonstrated that a dysfunctional gut has been shown to be significantly associated with risk for post-traumatic stress disorder, which I thought was interesting. So then that kind of took me to the question of, could our microbiome be a resiliency factor? Or a healthy gut be something that would be protective against mental illness? What do you think?
Absolutely, yes, I do. The fact that there aren't many studies on PTSD, but there are plenty on anxiety and depression, and in a way, often they're reacting to an event as well, and I think everyone in their life can get depressed or periods of anxiety and stress, but whether it hangs around and stays or occurs is due to your resilience factor. Some of that might be genetic, but increasingly I believe that having a healthy gut microbiome gives you that protection, because if you again came back to my pharmacy example, if you think of your pharmacy as fully loaded, you can go in and get any anti-anxiety chemical. You can get GABA. You call on it to produce. Give me some more GABA up here, guys. I I'm needing it. Give me some more serotonin. Give me some more nutrients, some more B vitamins that can affect the brain. Many we don't know about. Plus, again, making sure your immune system is not overreacting, doesn't lock down your brain into some, catastrophic scenario. It just calms it all down. Yeah. So I think absolutely, many of these common diseases that we're seeing now are influence mediated. I'm not saying they're necessarily the cause, but they definitely make it worse. Similarly with COVID, we did a giant survey in the UK. The Zoe company did a free app, and we had about several million people using it. We did a survey of 1 million people, somewhere in the US, but most in the UK, and their diets 6 months before, particularly if they had lots of ultra processed food, dictated whether they were highly likely to have severe COVID or not. And I think a lot of that's through the mediated through the gut microbes rather than a direct effect of the food.
Before we get into how to nurture our gut with what factors are going to promote and optimize balance, I just wondered if you had a good sense of how modifiable, how mutable is the gut microbiome, and over what time span can this be changed in quick fashion?
Well, the gut microbiome is made up of lots of different bits. There's some bits that change hour to hour. And so your gut microbiome is going to be very different tonight when you go to sleep than it is in the day. And so your different teams come out, and there's like offense and defense. You've got a team that comes out and cleans up your gut lining. And so if you're able to sample it progressively, you'd see that. And it will change every time you eat some food that you haven't eaten before. So if you changed from being carnivore to vegan, within 3 days, you'd see quite major changes, and vice versa.
Wow.
So you can get quite big changes, but then you'd also see perhaps a third of your microbiome wouldn't change very much, and you'd still have your signature. So you carry around your fingerprint, probably for life, because you've probably got unique microbes that are, less than 1 in 100,000 people have, particular strains that are unique to you. For some reason, they like your gut and no one else's. So it's definitely a mixture, but medicines change it. Many common things that we take change it. Foods change it. Time of year. When you travel abroad.
Let's talk about some of the foods. What are the central players in food that play into gut imbalance or gut health?
Well, the good guys are things like fiber, so diversity of plants, and this, when I'm writing books about food, this is a key practical tip, is for people to get not only more fiber into their diet, because 90% of Americans are deficient in fiber, but get diverse fibers, so lots of different plants. And because your microbes are really specific and fussy about the foods they eat. And so it's not just having kale salads every day isn't going to give you a wide diversity of microbes. You need these, we think 30 different plants a week to maximize your gut health. And that was a study we did about 10 years ago now with the British gut combined with the American gut, and we did about lots of people, and that was the sweet spot. And it didn't matter if you're a meat eater or a fish eater or a vegan. If you got those 30 plants, you had good gut health. So that's the first thing. And so each plant, and that's a nut, it's also a nut, a seed, a spice, an herb. They all count as plants. We forget what plants are. A cup of coffee counts as well.
Can I just bring up, can you give us a frame of reference for what that would look like 30 30 plants per week. I hear that, and to me, I'm like, I don't know if I can even name 30 plants per week. You know, like, can you give us maybe a sort of a practical guide on how to achieve something like that, if that's something that you're recommending?
Yes. Well, as I said, you've got to move away from thinking about it's all different types of kale, right?
Right.
So it's every type of fruit, it's every type of vegetable,
Mm.
it's every type of nut you've ever heard of, every type of seed you've ever heard of, and then every herb and every spice you've ever heard of. And the herbs and spices, you don't need much of them because they're highly concentrated plants. You just need, you know, a teaspoon of them, and that's enough. So what I do to get my 30 a day, just to give you an idea, is I have what's called a diversity jar, where I fill it with various nuts and seeds, and I sprinkle that for my morning on my yogurt, and I've ticked 10 off my list, right? Or I can put it on my salads. So there's different colored plants will also give you different chemicals, therefore they count. So a red pepper is going to be different to a yellow pepper or a green pepper. It's actually much easier than you think when you do this. And people show that just adding a spice mix to your plate will improve your gut microbes considerably. So, yeah, okay, the average American only has about, we think about nine to 10 different plants a week. So for many, it is a bit of a shift, but it's a shift in mentality rather than 5 a day, always having the same ones.
Right.
You're actually trying to find new things. It's quite fun. So we've got a cookbook just come out of the UK. It's going to come out in the US next year, really trying to get people to eat more foods in this way. And it's fun. And it brings in the second sort of general rule, which is eat the rainbow. So because different colored plants are telling you they've got defense chemicals in them called polyphenols, which you may have heard of. And the more brightly colored, the more of these chemicals there are, and the more bitter tasting, the more you have of them. And these are like rocket fuel for your gut microbes. So there are two ways everybody can improve their gut health in that way. And the third one is fermented foods, where the average American hardly has any fermented food, and usually it's ultra processed. So getting 3 different portions of them, so going from yogurt, kefir, cheese, sauerkraut, kimchi, kombuchas, all these things that, again, have big effects on improving your gut microbiome, shifting your immune system as well. And then avoiding ultra processed foods. 60% of food in the US for adults is ultra processed. Getting it down towards 10%, which is what southern Mediterranean countries have, I think it is really important. And finally, I'm a big fan of time restricted eating for the gut microbes, so that helps you heal your gut at night. It gives you a gut a rest.
Yeah. So what are the hours that you're recommending relative to the time restricted eating?
Well, I'm a big fan of trying whatever suits you. So we did a big study actually with Zoe, sort of citizen science project, where 140,000 people said they would do it. About a third of people gave up pretty quickly. We asked them to do 3 weeks of a 10-hour eating window and a 14-hour fasting window, eating the same amount of food. So you're supposed to have the same calories. You're not trying to diet. And a third find it quite tricky. They did it a bit. A third loved it, and they're still doing it. So I think it's very personal. It all comes down to this. We mustn't try and say there's the same plan for everybody. When I wake up in the morning, I don't know about you, but I'm not starving at 7 a.m. I don't suddenly feel like food. And many people are like me and probably don't have to eat until 11 in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And so it suits me, but I know I've got colleagues who do feel hungry when they wake up and they've just got to, get something in their belly.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all different.
Yeah. Sugar is a very hot topic, and I've seen I believe there's a movement now against eating fruits because they contain, I think, fructose. So now people are saying that you should be avoiding fruits because of that. Please give us some insight into sugar.
Well, as a general rule, avoid listening to anyone saying you should avoid this one thing.
Right.
As this will cure your disease.
Yes. We're
Okay.
tagging that.
Okay, so this is reductionism, and if it was that simple, we'd have all discovered the secret to life, wouldn't we? Right. If it was all just stopping eating one thing.
Yeah.
And it goes through phases, and social media makes this worse. Everyone's an expert on that one thing. Mm-hmm. And it can be gluten, it can be lectins in plants, it can be fructose in certain fruits, it can be whatever you want it to be, but basically it's generally BS. And beware the quick fix, and realize that if you eat a whole variety of foods, it doesn't matter, because it's what goes onto your plate, what goes into your gut. It's not that one item that's going to cause you damage, unless you are on some weird crackpot diet that insists you only eat cabbage, or you're doing this fasting regime. Mm-hmm. So when you think of food as 70,000 chemicals, it's a nonsense that you can think that just one of them is going to screw you up, and evolution hasn't taught us to deal with that. Yeah. You want to be having natural chemicals in food. So if there's lots of fructose in a bit of ultra processed food that you weren't supposed to eat, or then that's a reason to maybe avoid it. But I'd be also avoiding the other 30 chemicals in it. So yeah, I don't worry about any of those particular ideas, which might be a problem if you only ate that fruit. So if you had a smoothie with 20 mangoes in it, that could cause you problems. But you're unlikely to eat those in nature.
Yeah.
And in a similar vein, what about saturated fats?
Most are fine in the context of a normal diet. I mean, if you're only eating saturated fat and it's fried foods, that can be a problem. If you eat, there's nothing wrong with fats in general. There are good fats and bad fats, but I don't think we should demonize anything with saturated fat, because some of the healthiest foods contain saturated fat. For example, good quality cheese has lots of saturated fat in it, but it's also probiotic. It's got live microbes, or at least it does in European cheeses. I'm not sure some of the American home ones aren't as great.
It tastes like cardboard.
Yeah, so the ones that come in those slices may not be as live, but that's a good example that studies have shown, certainly in Europe, that people who eat a lot of cheese actually have less heart disease than people who don't eat cheese. Mm-hmm. Olive oil is 12% saturated fat, and if you have good quality olive oil, you reduce most of your risk of disease, cancer, dementia, heart disease by about a third. So it also depends what else is in that food. So again, my view is that we shouldn't be targeting saturated fat levels. We should be looking at the quality of the food you're eating and making sure it's not ultra processed. That's much more important. And if you have in general, Zoe, people do vary in their responses to fats. So if you do the Zoe test, we give everyone a standard cookie that has a high amount of fat in it, and we do a home blood test 3 hours later, which checks your triglyceride levels, which is a circulating blood fat level, which can vary tenfold in people. And so some people find it hard to eliminate fat from their diet, but most people can clear it pretty quickly, and so don't have any problems at all. So I'm one of those people that I have very poor sugar response, and I used to eat lots of carb breakfasts and things and low fat diets because that's what most doctors are taught. But I really thrived when I switched to having more of a high fat diet, and have a high fat, full fat yogurt in the morning, and lots of as much cheese as I can eat seems to suit me.
So let's talking about meat real quick. I think meat is a very hot topic too. The 2024 Alzheimer's Disease Association conference just presented that eating at least a quarter serving of processed red meat per day was associated with a 14% higher risk of dementia. Interestingly, and it goes to your point about, don't eat or try to avoid things that are processed, they also looked at the risk of unprocessed meat, and there was no increased risk for unprocessed meat. So give us some insight into that if you could, and just into meat in general.
Right, yeah, it's really interesting because after I got ill, the first thing I did was I said I'm going to go vegan for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And I gave up because I was actually traveling in the US, and it's pretty hard to be a healthy vegan in the US. And I also missed cheese. So I now have meat once or twice a month. And my reading of the literature is that a small amount of meat is perfectly healthy for you. And particularly, and you can have probably more than just once. You could have it probably several times a week and it'd still be quite healthy for you if you pick good quality meat. If you're picking good stuff that isn't full of hormones and antibiotics, and it isn't highly processed. So there's no doubt that every study ever done has shown that processed meats are bad for you, every bit of your body, including your brain. We don't really know why, whether it's the contents themselves, the fats, or it's the chemicals that sort of stick it together. But we should be having much less of them.
So,
and that's definitely true. But no one's really shown that low amounts of high quality meat are bad for you. But my view is that all this nutritional science is always a problem, because it always comes down to, well, instead of what? It's not, you can't just have this stuff on its own, right? It's not like a tablet you take.
Right.
You don't just say, okay, I'm going to have a hot dog. But instead of, what would you eat if you didn't eat a hot dog? What would you eat if you didn't have a big steak? And if you didn't have a big steak every night, you'd probably be eating more vegetables and more plants. So you'd be getting more closer to your 30 plants a week. Your gut microbiome would be better. So that's my view. Americans do eat a hell of a lot of meat, twice as much as the average European, and that means there's not much room on the average American plate for plants. So that's a good reason to cut back. I don't think there's any hard evidence to give it up completely, but having it once or twice a week rather than every 3 times a day would certainly be sensible, and spending more money on higher quality meat rather than this cheap stuff that is often cheaper than a salad.
Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about processed meat, this is hot dogs and cold cuts, but how can you tell if a piece of steak or poultry is processed or unprocessed?
Well, you've got to know where it's coming from. And, we need to ask more from the suppliers. And there's big differences in how, the meat is raised, whether it's grass-fed, organic, or it's, the cheapest one from South America that is full of all kinds of hormones and things. So I think, and the same goes for chickens, huge range. But if you're paying virtually nothing for it, you can be pretty sure where it is on the food chain, right?
Yeah.
So I think, I'd rather people ate less of this stuff, and they were a bit pickier about where it was coming from and what chemicals are in there. There's still too much antibiotic use in meat production, and that gets small amounts get into our gut, and that can actually impact our microbes, and maybe one reason why the American gut is so poorly.
So let's talk about diets then, right? Because we're talking about a lot of different factors. Do you have, if you had to pick an ideal diet, I hate to put you in this position, and you can always say you're not going to pick a diet, but if you had to pick an ideal diet that incorporates not all, but most of the principles, the guiding principles you're talking about, which one would you pick?
Okay, well, I mean, I'm going to caveat it, said I would like to personalize my diet first and take the Zoe test. But if I wasn't allowed to, I would probably go for a old-fashioned Mediterranean style diet. And that's before they had enormous amounts of pasta and pizza. So this is, when you used to have goat's cheese and a little bit of fish. They'd have meat or fish a couple of times a week, but it would be lots of fresh vegetables, lots of beans, lentils, those legumes. They're really big in traditional Mediterranean diets. Be getting a lot of fiber, lots of dairy. Dairy would be quite a big thing in that. A lot of it fermented, and they get lots of nuts and seeds, and the whole thing washed down with lots of olive oil, which we think has been shown in a number of studies now that nuts, seeds, olive oil is a really good core to the diet, and much better than vegetable oils or coconut oils or peanut oils or anything else that's being used at the moment. So and even they seem to survive with a glass of red wine as well. So that's why I like it.
And how about moving to an extreme, the ketogenic diet? It's obviously shown some recent data to suggest it's protective for the brain and certain disorders that rely on good brain function and development. Can you comment on that as in respect to the microbiome?
Yeah, well, as you know, it's been used for decades, really, in epilepsy in children, and does have powerful effects on the brain that we still don't totally understand, but they really are impactful. So we know it works, and it certainly works in some people in terms of weight loss and helping them with type 2 diabetes. Now, for most people, though, having a diet that's 70% fat is virtually impossible to maintain for long periods of time. I've tried it. I couldn't hack it at all. I felt terrible. So I think there's only a small percentage of the population that can keep it up, who don't have type 2 diabetes. Those people who do like it, they're very like religious zealots going around saying how everyone should convert to it. But my problem is, after that initial phase of maybe some weight loss and feeling better, you're just hurting your gut, because you're starving your gut microbes, because there's very little in the ketogenic diet that is good for your microbial health, because fiber is very low in that group. They often get constipation and gut disorders. And so unless you're really careful, it's very hard to have sufficient keto, fat in there to keep your ketogenic state, whilst also keeping your gut happy. So by all means, I'm not against people trying it short term to see if that radically improves something, but I think they need to shift to a very high, much higher fiber diet to help their gut long term. Otherwise, they're going to get many other long term problems. But I think the main thing is most people can't handle it. So there's quite a personal effect to how you handle fats as well. As you know, as we discovered in our Predict studies, if there's a tenfold difference in how we all respond to fats, then it's logical that you might find some people get on with these diets,
Right.
But most of us probably can't. So it should stay as a niche diet, not mainstream.
Now, what about snacking? Is this, I've read your book. Kev's also gone over your book, so we know how you feel about certain topics. Are you willing to universalize the idea of maybe cutting back on snacking, or do you think that's a little bit more personalized as well?
Well, it sort of depends. There's healthy snacking and there's unhealthy snacking, isn't there? So, what you're smiling? So, what's your go-to snack?
Um, trail mix. Trail mix without any of the chocolate in it, of course.
Well,
what is that? That's
again,
a lot
there
of
are healthy
nuts.
trail mixes and they're unhealthy. Some of them have lots of dried fruit in it and raisin sultanas, which can be quite sugary.
Yeah.
So it can be quite sweet in some of them. And so if you're having those late at night, you say 10 o'clock in the night, you feel a bit hungry, you have that. That's not going to be good for you. So we've done studies in Zoe looking at snacking habits, and late night snacking, even if it's semi good, if it was just nuts on its own, is not associated with good metabolic health, not associated with good microbes.
Mm-hmm.
During the day, it's probably less important. If you're having a healthy snack during your normal eating times, it's probably fine.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a nuanced answer here. But if you're eating unhealthy snacks, most snacks, 80% of snacks are ultra processed, and these protein bars we're seeing now, they're just dreadful.
What's a good snack then? 80% of snacks are ultra processed. What do you snack on? Do you snack? B, what is it that you snack on?
Well, I'm not a big snacker, but if I'm presented with a bowl of peanuts or cashew nuts, I'll swallow them up. Okay. So mixed nuts. So if I'm traveling and there's not much to eat, I'll have a big bag of mixed nuts with me, and I'll eat those. Probably too many, but I will eat them. Try and carry an apple or a pear with me. I no longer would have a snack bar.
Right.
None of them really are healthy, and although they promise all kinds of things on the label, high protein and low calorie and energy giving and full of vitamins, they're all bad for you.
Yeah,
and
so
we should learn them.
It's really interesting, right? Me and Kev were talking about this. Where is all this coming from that's being presented to us at the grocery store on these snacks saying high protein, Diet Coke, 0 calories,
high calcium, high potassium for your bones and for your muscles.
So what's happening there, especially if might not be the healthiest thing for our microbiome and for our overall health? Like, what is that?
It's called marketing by big food. And so basically they've decided that particularly younger males are very susceptible to anything that makes them think they're going to get bigger muscles by eating this bar. Mm-hmm. And so they've realized that everyone can be made fearful into thinking they're protein deficient, and therefore going to look puny. And if they can't snack on this stuff, they'll be the weakest of the group. It's total nonsense. So that's why it's gone wild, particularly the last couple of years. There's added protein to everything, and we don't need protein.
Right.
Over 90% of us have more than enough protein. And unless you're a professional bodybuilder, the little old lady who's finding it hard to eat, or you've got some other real medical condition, you know, we're getting far excess of protein. We just pee it out or convert it to fat because you can't store protein.
But what is that? What is that based off of? What is that based off of though? Right? It's not, you know, these snack companies determining that protein is good for us. They're basing their marketing off of something. So what is that something that they're basing their marketing off of, and why is it incorrect?
It's hard to know where it starts. I mean, obviously, gyms sell products. If you go to a gym, all you see is whey protein powders. So the dairy industry is producing. People are drinking less milk, and so there's an excess of dairy that is getting. A lot of that is being converted into these protein powders. So they have to get rid of it some way, and so this is driving a lot of the industry. And then you have gyms selling this to young men, that they can't be bodybuilders unless they're drinking gallons of this stuff, and they won't put on any muscle. So they're putting, instead of saying, well, actually, you just have eggs and, you know, eat a normal diet. Mm-hmm. They're saying you have to have all these artificial expensive items. So it's a combination of those things plus influencers saying we're protein deficient and this is our main problem. But if you speak to the real nutrition scientists, there's, you know, with these exceptions, there are a few exceptions, but for 90% of us, it is rubbish and marketing. But this is what the food industry does. They're very powerful. They can get articles written in any newspaper they want. They can tell us whatever is truth, and that's what they've done with calories. That's what they did with fats, and they love to reformulate products, and it's so cheap for them to add in extra protein into anything and use that as it costs them nothing, and they can charge you an extra $1 for it, and they're making more money. So I think it's just marketing gimmicks.
So it ends up being a pretty confusing space for someone who's just trying to pack their refrigerator and pantry with foods that they can protect their brain with and develop their kids with. I know that you've talked about continuous glucose monitors, services like Zoe, to track the gut's response to some of these food groups that we talked about. Tell us a little bit more about that and whether you'd recommend that for everybody, or is it a nuanced population?
So, we've tested getting on for 250,000 people now, I think, with Zoe, mainly in the UK, but also in the US. And again, I think the realization that everyone has a different response to carbohydrates and fats, tenfold difference, is really interesting. And it's certainly changed the way I eat and I pick my foods. I never look at a croissant again the same way. Now I've seen what happens when I'm eating one when I'm wearing one of these sugar monitors, and reassuring to know that my fat control is reasonably good, so I can tuck into the cheese at the end of a meal as well. I think going through that process and then working out what my gut health is like as well. So these three main tests give you a really good snapshot of how you respond to most foods and what your overall gut health is like compared to other people. And then you get recommendations through an app that allows you then personalize any food, and you can take pictures of a plate of food. It will score it for you based on your own personal responses, so that you can continue. It helps you make the right choices every day, really. I think that's it. And it's an educational journey, so it's not meant as a quick fix diet or anything else. It's changed the way you think about food, and then it encourages you to introduce the things we were talking about: the 30 plants, the color, the diversity, the fermented foods into your meals, etc. So people that we've done a randomized trial on this, which we published in Nature Medicine, which is very unusual, as you know, in this field for anyone to publish any product in the nutrition space, but showing that people who do stick to it will get real benefits. Interesting, the first things that they notice are mood and energy. So coming back to your questions about the brain.
Yeah.
And I think you agree, most doctors don't ask people about their mood and energy as their first questions. And yet it's the most important thing. Biggest effects we saw, people shifting their diets, was on mood and energy. Then you get some weight loss, not massive, because we don't want a massive weight loss. We want it to be a small amount gradually that carries on for years, not just a few weeks and bounces back. And improvements generally in visceral fat levels and metabolism and the usual blood markers, etc. And the microbiome shifts as well that we see after about 6 weeks. We start to see quite significant shifts in the gut microbes. So the idea is that these are tools to help you make the right food choices, and that you carry around the app with you, and it's like an extension, having a textbook there that you can just look at things, and makes you think about food differently.
Yeah.
I think that's the key that we've found, that people who do this successfully have got, they won't look at the same packet of food the same way again. They'll be seeing it in this more complex way, this more nuanced way.
Yeah. So, certainly when I just think about scaling something so personalized, what about, is there any way for someone not using these trackers, still trying to personalize their diet and optimize their gut health, to be able to have some sense of how they're doing in that regard without actually tracking?
Yeah, I think you can crudely do this. So I urge everyone, so like we talked about time restricted eating, you can experiment with that and see how well you get on with that. And that will tell you whether you're more of a snacker or you can actually postpone your meals a bit better, how easy that's going to be. Experiment with your breakfast. So, if you're a Cheerios kind of guy, or, English muffin and jelly, you might want to swap that for a high fat one of full fat yogurt with nuts and seeds, or an egg. And then track how you feel 3 hours later. I think we're not trained, certainly not in medicine, and the general public are not trained to really listen to their body enough. And I think this is what these apps obviously make it a lot easier for you. But if we're able to eat a meal and then keep a diary, and then say, okay, 3 hours later, what happens to me after whether it's eating my granola meal or my cereal or whatever it is, and then you compare them. What's your energy level like 3 hours later? What's your mood like? Do you still feel hungry? And so that's how most of the people who've been successful in this, that's the big improvements they get. They find the food that suits them best. So you can do it both through trial and error. It'll just take you a lot longer, and you need to be quite dedicated to do it. But I think what we're doing is giving people the more sophisticated tools to make it a lot easier. But if everyone listened to their gut, kept notes, they'd work out why they have that mid-morning slump, as many of us do. When you say, I need that chocolate cookie or brown, something to keep me going. And you think, well, hang on a minute, why do I need that at 11 a.m.? Maybe it's what I was eating that morning. Maybe I need to change that. Or maybe it was what I was eating the night before that could still have an effect. Or maybe it was because I didn't get enough sleep that night. So all these factors are there. It's kind of hard for humans to put all those things together. But to answer your question, you can do it, but it's definitely easier if you've got help.
Now, in your work, you've busted a lot of myths. You've been able to come down pretty hard on certain topics, and I'm sure you've gained some critics with some decent arguments behind why the microbiome might be not so central in human health and disease. What's the best critique or argument you've got against the microbiome being a central player?
Well, yeah, I faced that really since I started to try and get grants back in about 2011 or 2009, I think it was. Luckily, the US was ahead of Europe in that, so I got my first grant in the US. But the critique really is it's this whole body of evidence that that we've got. There isn't one knockout study, for example, that demonstrates it, but I think the fact that it is related to every disease, that there's hardly any examples where the microbiome doesn't play a role. I think the fact that you can take it from humans and put it into mice and have big effects on mice is really cool, and doesn't happen with easily in other areas. So we don't have that sterile mouse model, which is really useful. And I think we're there's now 2 licensed microbial products which the FDA have just approved, which are artificial ways of giving poop transplants, basically, used for nasty infections. And I think people just look at the amount of research that's going on and see how it's exponentially going up, and the amount of commercial interest in products and pharmaceutical interest. For me, I think the biggest impact is a study we did on melanoma. We had about 200 people with stage 4 melanoma on immunotherapy drugs, and they have about a 50% survival rate. And the people at the beginning whose gut microbes were the healthiest had like double the survival of those who had poor gut microbiomes.
Wow.
So I'd say to anyone, if you're facing cancer therapy and you're going to ignore your gut microbiome, that's the worst decision you're going to make of your life. And so for me, those big life or death examples, I think, are probably the best, and how we really need to look after our gut microbes if we're, going to get out of this health crisis we're all in.
All right. Wonderful. All right. So we talked about a lot. So we really want to distill things down for our audience, right? It typically happens in conversations like these. There's a lot of high level topics, complex topics that are talked about, and maybe we can get lost in the weeds in terms of our guiding principles. So if you had to leave us with 3 to 5 guiding principles, or any number that you want, that our audience and me, I don't know about you, probably you too, but that we could do to just optimize our gut health, what would you say?
Sure, I'll give you six principles, which are
these your go-to 6? These are the ones.
These are the go-to 6, which are the essence of my new cookbook, which should be out soon. So, number 1 is eat your 30 plants a week. Okay, we discussed what a plant is. That gives you maximum diversity. Then you don't have to worry about fiber or anything else like that. It all follows. You don't have to count. Just try and get as many as you can. Even if you don't make it, go for it. Eat the rainbow. Get those colors on your plate, because that's giving you polyphenols, plus all the slightly bitter foods as well. So that's coffee's really good, a health drink, as is dark chocolate. Not Hershey's, but they're over 70% good stuff, and even things like olive oil. Then have regular fermented foods, so that you're trying to get not just the occasional bit of yogurt, but if you can get 3 portions a day, that's optimum for your immune health and your gut health. Pivot your protein so that you don't rely on meat for your protein, which you probably don't need that much of, and you switch to pulses and legumes, which have a lot of protein in them, and there's the same amino acids in plants as there are in meat. And they also have lots of fiber. So that's really, really what we should be having much more of. Go for quality, not calories. So don't think about calories. Calories are irrelevant. They've failed to, even on menus and things, they're just a waste of time. Calorie counting is a waste of time for most people. And that's why all the calorie counting companies have given up now, and they're just dishing out Ozempic. Finally, give your gut a rest. So time restricted eating is going to be good for most people that do it. So give it a try. And that also means cutting out your late night snacking. Give your gut microbes a rest. So if you remember those 6, you'll be doing all you need for your gut health.
That's
Absolutely.
tremendous.
Yeah, incredible.
That's simple. I think people can follow that, and having a guiding principle instead of a very restricted diet that over-focuses on sugar, calories, fat, or one of these other single.
And it makes it fun. It makes it fun to eat, because you're going out, you're picking new stuff on the menu, you're trying to be interesting and, trying new things all the time. And that's what it's abundance. It's adding things to your plate, not taking them away. Yeah. And if people want more information, there's the Zoe Nutrition podcast. That's the #1 English-speaking podcast in the world now. That's all free. People can get information there. And we keep your eye on what's happening with Zoe, because we should be having some other products as well to help people.
Incredible.
Do this that as well as the main one.
Yeah, and you have a cookbook coming out that you mentioned before. Do you want to rehash that? Do you want to reiterate that?
I don't know when it's coming out.
Okay.
We've got a US publisher. It will be coming out next year. It's called Food for Life Cookbook, which is the same name as the theory book, which is you can get in the US, Food for Life.
Yeah.
But so watch this space.
Incredible. It's been an honor to have you. Thank you so much. We really appreciate not only your time, but also the work that you've done with the microbiome. I mean, you're the pioneer, and certainly, I have a lot of gratitude for all the work that you've done. And we just scratched the surface with this microbiome stuff. You mentioned Ozempic. I have right here, and Kevin saw on our notes, I had Ozempic as, a topic for us to discuss, especially as it relates to how it influences the microbiome. But unfortunately, we ran out of time. But certainly we want to have you back if you'd be willing to come back so that we can dig a little bit deeper on some of these topics.
I'd love to. Yeah. There's plenty more to talk about.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Everyone out there, thanks a lot for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. But most importantly, stay safe, be well.